Welcome back to Connection Point Studies. Hey, we got a couple of things coming up. I just want to mention them really quickly.
All right.
We have Under the Big Top on Halloween weekend. On that Friday, you got to come. You got to come. It's a ticketed event, but the kids come in free. You want to invite all of your family and friends in.
You can come as a small group.
You can. And bring. You got to bring kids in. In fact, you can even volunteer as a small group. It's a big thing. It's where we bring in all the community, and just as normal, we have some big acts coming that are going to be really, really exciting. Fun.
Cool.
The second thing is there's a concert coming in. It's a ticketed concert, kind of our first one in this building, a really cool concert called Rush of Fools, and you're going to want to be a part of that. It's on Friday night, November 12th. So enough for our advertisement.
Okay.
Let's dig into the warm-up question.
All right. So, I was thinking about, the other day I saw this young couple, just nice in love, and I just remembered back to when I was like that, and I thought, boy, the kind of advice you might give a couple like that, just if you could sit down with them and you share some wisdom, but
what would that be, Ron?
What would it be? One thing. Okay, you get one thing that you would share with a young couple about to get married.
Not two things, one thing. And everybody in your group share, and then come back and read Colossians chapter 3, verses 17 through 19 before you come back. I wish I could have been in that room listening to some of the advice.
Yeah.
I don't even want to ask you this because you'll get in trouble with your wife and me too, I'm sure. But I think it's great that we shared our pieces of advice. Now, we had them read a section of Scripture, and this is one of those Scriptures we're going to study tonight that's going to maybe draw some interesting conversations.
Yeah, and in fact, it is a passage where Paul gives some advice to couples. And I bet that probably nobody suggested Paul's advice.
Right. I would say that very few ever point to this Scripture as a piece of advice for couples.
Yeah.
So let's dig into it. I think we'll get a little bit more if we really kind of dig into the overall structure of it. You included chapter 7 or verse 17 along with 18 and 19. But our first question really focuses on 18.
Right.
So let's dig in. What first question can we give them?
Okay, here's Paul's answer to the warm-up question for wives. What one piece of advice does Paul give wives?
Oh, yeah. I can't wait. All right, here it is. One piece of advice. Submit.
I don't know. I probably would never, I wouldn't suggest that one.
I'm just curious how many guys got an elbow or a hit, or how many wives are fuming at this point, and how do we come to grips with this? Now really what we want to do is dig into this a little bit further. So let's look at question 2, because I think it really focuses on this piece of advice.
Yeah, and so if you notice, maybe some people in the room have different Bible translations. You might see a different word there. It might say, be subject to, like the New American Standard says that. And so I think what we have to do is kind of understand, what exactly do you think he means when he says submit?
Right. So you talk about that a little bit. What do you think submission means? What was his piece of advice to the wives? And what did that mean? And then we'll come back and talk about it. Okay, Ron, the Greek word is, I never know how to pronounce these things.
Hupotasso.
Hupotasso.
Yeah.
There you go. We learned a new word.
And it's a military term. So it's a term that means to rank under. So just like a private ranks under a sergeant. And it doesn't mean that a private's an inferior being or that, a sergeant can kill the private if he wants to or whatever. It's simply a description of authority in a structure, an organization. Just like, if it were business, you might have the CEO and the vice president or something like that.
So you wouldn't go home to Brenda and say, now, honey, I want you to submit tonight.
Not if I wanted to live, I wouldn't.
Okay, so we have to deal with our own culture. We have to deal with that culture a little bit.
Yeah.
And we have to dig into this even a little bit more. Our culture looks at submission with some very different, interesting pictures, word pictures in our mind.
Yeah.
And I mean, let's go a little bit further, and we'll come
Right.
back to this question and how we apply this a little bit further. So we have a third question for them to kind of focus on.
Right,
So,
right. So the third question is, once you start going down this road, people say, well, are there some limits here? Is it anything, if a husband says this, you have to do it? Or are there some limits in there? And so that's a good question. Why don't you take a minute and talk about that?
Okay, so the limits that Paul put in there is as is fitting to the Lord, right? Or in the Lord.
Yeah.
And there's some spiritual limits, right? We need to be submissive to God. We're all under God. Mm-hmm. And in the leadership of God in our life, we need to honor Him as the leader of our life. And as long as it's fitting, we need to honor the leadership of a husband.
Yeah.
Ron, do you think that some of this is a backhanded way for God maybe to say to some of us men to step up and be better leaders in our homes sometimes?
Well, this is where we're going in the next question.
Is it? I'm always jumping ahead, aren't I, Ron?
So Paul does give some advice to husbands.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So the next question is, what advice does Paul give husbands? And in fact, you can find this in verse 19, and to dig a little deeper, you can look at what Paul said in Ephesians 5:28 and 29. And then Peter has some thoughts on this in 1 Peter 3:7.
So Paul says to husbands that they should love their wives.
Yeah.
This was a little offensive, actually, to the culture of that day, wasn't it?
Yeah. Actually, in that day, the husband was the ruler, man. He was the unquestioned ruler of the home. You could do whatever you want, and, whatever little scraps the wife got is,
They
fine,
were kind of possessions in that day.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this was a little offensive. He was really saying, step up. Love your wives. Give them... let's talk about the meaning of that. What do you think the meaning of that is in this passage?
Well, so when he says in Ephesians, you should love your wife as Christ loved the church, and wow, what an incredible challenge. I mean, think about what Christ has done for us, and the sacrifice, and the laying down his life, and the endless grace and mercy. It's such a high bar. How anybody could look at this and say that the Bible teaches that I get to just rule my home with an iron fist is just completely wrong. And then Peter, he's often misunderstood too, because, he says you should you treat your wives with respect as with a weaker vessel. And so people go, is he calling women weak? That's not really the point. The term there refers to a physical or emotional, like they're physically not as strong and more delicate is the idea. And so not intellectually inferior.
That was before they had gyms. Some of our wives can take us. I know that.
Yeah, probably so.
Okay, so let me just say this. I believe those two things are almost the same thing. Because when you look at a wife when you say to wives, submit to your husbands, being willing to take second place, right? Being willing to be under the leadership of your husband. Yeah. Now, husbands say you're supposed to love your wives, which means you think of them as more important than yourself.
Right.
What's the difference in that, Ron? I don't see any difference. They're each equally doing the same thing, each of them thinking of the other person as more important than themselves.
Yeah, and it could be just that, wives are pretty good at loving their husbands. You don't really need to remind wives about that, but you probably do need to remind husbands about it. And so,
but let's be honest, in our culture today, maybe it should be switched around a little bit. Sometimes I think the message of the day is, what is the more difficult thing for you to do? Is it more difficult for you to submit or to love? Whatever it is that is more difficult for you to do, I think that's the piece that God calls us to do in our relationship.
So there's another part of Paul's instruction to husbands, though, that we need to get to, which is, he says in the second part of that verse, that you shouldn't be harsh. Don't treat them harshly. Right. Or New American Standard says be embittered towards them. And so I just want to know, again, how do you do that? How can you avoid that?
Okay, take a minute and talk about that, and we'll come back. So, Ron, you say husbands should avoid ruling their home like a dictator, right? Isn't that really the bottom line?
I mean, you know, harsh treatment is just kind of incompatible with love.
Wouldn't it be the same? Really, neither should take that role in a house, right?
Right.
There shouldn't be a wife that's a dictator or a husband that's a dictator. There shouldn't be a harsh treatment really of either one. And in the culture that Paul was talking to, there were really some husbands that treated their wives harshly.
So, you know, I just wonder, how does this view of marriage really match up to our culture's view? Do you think it matches, or would people say, you're just being old-fashioned?
Yeah. Have some fun. We'll get back. Okay, Ron, is this old-fashioned?
I bet you most people would say that it is. I think...
the way it was applied years ago and the way these words were translated and used, I think in some aspects we're very old-fashioned. And yet they're not old-fashioned. They have power for...
Well, maybe what's old-fashioned is the way it was misapplied.
That's good.
Yeah,
that would be...
Yeah, you imagine the guy who said, no, you know, woman, make my dinner. You know, kind of, I mean, you know, that he didn't apply this, husband, love your wives, right?
No, they didn't. And really, there's a devaluing of women. Some people look at that as devaluing women.
Right.
When that was actually the problem in that culture of that day, wasn't it? They devalued women. And that's not our culture. That's not the Christian culture.
Yeah, in fact, Christianity was radical in the sense that it called men to love their wives, to put them first, really elevate them. Yeah.
And it's a powerful culture. Now, one last question we want them to really think about and apply. This is kind of an application question, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's sort of an interesting Bible study question. I mean, you know, if you look at the Bible, there's a lot of things that you read and you'll see like, oh, they used to sacrifice animals, for example, in the Old Testament, and we don't do that today. So some people say, well, maybe this command's like that. Maybe it's something they used to do, and we don't do that today. We do something else. Do you think that what Paul is saying here, is this in that kind of category? Is it just for them, or is it just as applicable to us today?
Be fun to talk about that. And as you kind of close out your study, Ron, I think we'll let them kind of deal with this question on their own. But as you close out your study today, maybe it's a good time for you to be reminded of the marriages and that you know of that are in turmoil, and just to kind of pray for those marriages that they'll be stronger and be built up. And so take a little bit of time and share together and pray for each other, and let's encourage strong families. And we'll see you next week at Connection Point Studies.